So in my last video I discussed Robert Bella's understanding of religion and its place in the evolution of our species, and I contrasted it with Richard Dawkins' view. And Mario commented to say, Dawkins is a pretty easy target. Why don't you spend your time thinking about and responding to thinkers like Sam Harris, whose views on religion are similar to Dawkins, but unlike Dawkins, Harris is, um, his scientific materialism is more restrained, um, and he's open to spirituality, to non-ordinary states of consciousness that are produced either by psychedelics or through meditative training, and that he recognizes that there is something more to reality than the ego's perspective on an external objective world, and that by training our consciousness, altering it in various ways, we can come to experience a new kind of reality that is not as alienating and is not as dualistic. And so he's recently published this book, Waking Up, that discusses these ideas. And I think certainly his openness to spiritual practice, to his recognition of the fact that consciousness is malleable, certainly makes him more of a friend, an intellectual friend to my way of thinking. On the other hand, I think it's not. I don't necessarily think that rejecting eliminative materialism, as Harris does, is some kind of great intellectual achievement. I think it's quite obvious that trying to reduce consciousness to neurology is just confused dogmatism. I think I would expect someone with the neurological training and the philosophical education of Harris would come to that conclusion quite naturally and easily. That first-person consciousness is irreducible, and though it can be correlated to brain states, it can't finally be identified with that there's a sort of intrinsic nature to consciousness, and that there are certain questions that either we're going to answer through phenomenological inquiry into our own experience or not at all. I think I'm glad that he thinks that way, and I think clear logic and coherent, empirically grounded reflection should lead everyone to that conclusion. So I'm on the same page with him there. It's just he goes on to talk about religion in a way that I think assumes what in sociology used to be called the secularization thesis, which was that as science and technology and capitalist democracy and consumerism and so on spread throughout the world, that religion would just naturally wither away. It wouldn't be relevant to people anymore because they would have scientific explanations for seemingly miraculous events. They'd have modern medicine that cured diseases and wouldn't need to believe in demons, and that they would just recognize that money and freedom were the only values they needed to guide their ethical life. And clearly, though technoscience and consumer capitalism have continued to spread their tentacles across the planet and tie more civilizations, more societies together into this this knot of resource exploitation and alienated labor, still, even in those societies that have been colonized by techno-capitalism, religion proliferates, and we're seeing a resurgence of religion on a grand scale, which it totally contradicts the secularization thesis. The sort of meaninglessness, the nihilistic void that contemporary, consumer capitalist culture has thrown many people into has led to, a sort of resurgence of the wackiest, most violent forms of religious affiliation, because people are just hungry for meaning, and they can't find any in secular society. All they find in secular society is a sort of cynical self-critique, that reason itself has fallen prey to critique, to its own critique. And so, to be a secular person who's thoughtful, I think it necessarily leads you into this sort of, cynical, nihilistic point of view. And most people can't hang out there. They need more. They need meaning. And I would agree with Harris that we need more alternatives to traditional religion for people to find and to make meaning for their lives. I think that the idea that we could do that with rationality alone, this sort of enlightenment myth that we might live without myth, again, this secularization thesis that Harris appears to be holding to, I think it is itself an illusion, right? It's the worst kind of myth, a myth that doesn't recognize its own mythic basis. It's the myth of mythlessness, right? That reason could become truly autonomous, that it could arrive at ethical, aesthetic, political, and spiritual insights independently of narrative, of emotion, of feeling, and of myth, of ritual. And I don't think the evidence bears out that idea. Reason has always, reason and science have always remained embedded within societies. They've always been cultural activities that groups of people do together. I just watched this video that's gotten 1 million hits called "The War on Science." I'll post a link to it. And it sort of pits science against society, as though since Galileo was locked in his home and his books put on the index, and since Bruno was burnt at the stake and so on, that there's been this war between social norms and culture and religion and science. This is said as though science is somehow not a cultural activity, is not something that people do together in groups because they share interests in certain projects. I mean, science is a cultural activity. Science is not against society. It doesn't take place outside of a social context. It's a false dichotomy, and I think leads us into certain the same sort of problematic in-group, out-group dynamics that Harris despises about the religious world. So, instead of that sort of posturing and taking this approach to the culture war, where one identifies as secular or as an atheist and thinks that all religious people are stupid and in need of enlightenment, I think that's counterproductive, and it's only going to further fan the flames of this clash of civilizations that may indeed do us in as a species. So I think we need another approach there, something more diplomatic, something more pluralistic, and not just culturally pluralistic, like a sort of relativism, but no, ontologically pluralistic, and I'm not going to go into that here. I've written quite a bit about that, and I can direct you to some essays and blog posts of mine about ontological pluralism, which I think is an alternative to this sort of still residual scientism that's guiding a lot of what Harris is saying. I think we need more than reason, or at least we need an expanded conception of reason, where we recognize that reason is always dependent upon imagination, narrative, myth, aesthetics, feeling, that there are multiple faculties that human beings depend upon in order to get around in the world, in order to live harmoniously with one another and with the planet. We can't just rely on some kind of disembedded autonomous rationality. Again, that is an Enlightenment myth that has wrought tremendous destruction, both to society and to nature. And I can provide resources to help unpack what I'm trying to say when I make that comment. I'll post links. So I'm going to actually make a separate video about what Harris was saying in regard to psychedelics, because I think that's a very interesting topic worthy of its own inquiry. So I'll leave this video here and invite reflections from anyone who's called. Thanks for listening.